Okay, wonderful. So it is really delightful to be here with you all today. For anybody I haven't met in person in the last year, my name is Alexandra Stein. I'm the newish, no longer super new rabbi at TRS. And I'm delighted to be here with you all today for the start of our summer Limmud and to kick us off to have Dr. Daniel May here to do some teaching for us. So I wanted to do a little bit of framing of the genesis of this particular summer Limmud. Those of you who have been to TRS summer Limmuds in the past know that we pick a different theme every summer. This is the first time that we're trying doing the first three Limmuds over Zoom, kind of in deference both to our topic, which involves a lot of guest teachers who live in other places, and also to people's summer schedules of travel. And we hope those of you joining us from different coasts are like having a great time. And then our last Limmud on July 30th will be in person. We wanted to, so every summer we pick a topic. This summer we wanted to think about Zionism and our relationships with Israel, because for many people in our community in the Jewish world, it's a topic that keeps coming up in different ways, particularly as we navigate the present moment. So our next three sessions after today are really going to be sessions that focus on different aspects of the present tense, where we have some speakers who they work in organizations that do very particular work related to Israel, and they're going to be sharing some about their work and giving us time to ask them questions. The concept behind today's gathering is a little bit different. We've invited Dr. Daniel May, who was one of my teachers when I was at Hebrew Union College, and he's a really lovely teacher, and that's kind of the primary reason we invited him, because he's a great teacher, who is going to be doing some interactive teaching with sort of both opportunities to listen, but also to discuss our own thoughts in breakout rooms about the history of Zionist thought, what Zionism has meant, what it could mean, and sort of really giving us some opportunities to think about our own relationships with this. And as a clergy team, the clergy team and Cantor leader wanted to start off our summer Limmud with a session like this, because we're really hoping that all of our sessions will be opportunities for our communities to reflect on our own relationship with this, and for people to be able to think about, where am I at and what do I want to do as a result of where I'm at? How do I want to relate to Israel, to the global Jewish people? Sort of, what does this mean to me? And so we're really delighted to have Daniel May here with us today to launch us into some study and learning that we hope will be something that can sort of support us and give us a framing for the time that we're going to be spending together. I'll invite you, I'll ask Daniel to tell us how he wants people to ask questions. I'm guessing because of our size, maybe that will be like a chat option or maybe a hand raise function option, but I'll ask him to tell us that. And I will do my best to pay attention to the chat and letting people in throughout our time. And so with that brief introduction, I would love to turn it over to Dr. Daniel May. I'm going to briefly read aloud his bio that's on the Hartman website, with hopes that it's okay and he can tell us if he wants to modify it. So, Daniel May is a fellow of the Kogut Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He received his PhD in religion, ethics, and politics in the Department of Religion at Princeton University in 2020, and currently teaches at Hebrew Union College and serves as the publisher of Jewish Currents. His academic research is in 20th century Jewish political thought and political theory, with a focus on the relationship between Cold War liberalism and American Zionism. In addition to his academic work, Daniel has over 2 decades of experience in community labor organizing and political organizing. So with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Stein. It's great to be with all of you. It's great to be back with Rabbi Stein. You're all very lucky to have her, as I'm sure you have learned over the last year. So it's a real pleasure to be with you and to be in this conversation. These are questions and issues that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and I think are really paramount for the challenges that we face as a community and our future. So the title that I was given for this session is there a future for Zionism? And in some respects, I think this question is sort of self-evident, which is that, of course, there is a future for Zionism. There are going to be Jews living in the land of Israel for decades and generations to come. But the question of what is the future for Zionism? What is that community going to look like? What is the political arrangement of that community? What is the relationship between that community and the rest of world Jewry? I think that these questions are ones that we're going to continue to be wrestling with for years to come. So what I wanted to try to do today was really to turn back the clock and look to the origins of Zionism as a primarily an intellectual movement. So to look at the ideas that were presented by the early Zionists as they began to argue over what was the purpose and aim of this movement. And one of the things that we're going to see is that there was far from consensus on these basic questions, that there was a great deal of disagreement within the Zionist movement among Zionist thinkers over really the central questions of Zionism, such as what is the problem to which Zionism is responding? There was not agreement on that question. What is the political arrangement that Zionism should achieve? There was not agreement on that question. What is the relationship between a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel and Jews outside of that homeland? There was not agreement on that question. What should be the relationship between Jews in this homeland and the Arab population of that same land? Not agreement on that question. So we're going to look at some of these debates. And what I want to do for most of our time together is actually dig into the text together. So for those of you who have done a fair amount of reading in early Zionist thought, some of this may be review. We're going to look at some Herzl. We're going to look at some Chada'am. We'll look at some Pinsker, some Rav Kook, hopefully a little Jabotinsky. Because what I want to try to do is give all of you, as you embark on these sessions over the coming weeks, some basic facility and knowledge with the strands of Zionism as it emerged, the different strands that shaped the Zionist conversation in its early decades. And if you're already familiar, again, with those different strands, then some of this is going to be a little bit of review. But I think as you all get into the central contemporary challenges, I think it's at least the wager of our hour together is that looking to the past is helpful as a way of seeing some of the arguments that have been central to Zionism from its very start. So in terms of the order of operations, what I want to do is give relatively quickly, in some ways, it's going to be quite crude as an overview introduction to the sort of historical factors. We're going to do it in like 15 or 20 minutes. This is obviously something that one could study for years and years, but just a bit of overview. And then we're going to do breakouts and dig into some text selections that I pulled from these various Zionist writers. And then we're going to come back and talk about it. What surprised you, what jumped out at you, what provoked you, and how is any of this relevant for today's discussions and controversies? So hopefully all that sounds okay and is at least not too far afield from what you thought you were signing up for this morning. As far as how to, I would love for this to be as much of a conversation amongst all of you as possible. There are, however, 50 of you on the call on the Zoom. So what that means first is that I can't see everybody. So that means that raising your hand is not going to suffice because you could be on the two screens over and I just won't be able to see it. So please do ask questions in the chat. You can also do a raise hand function and I'll try to find you and get to you, but I think probably I would love to get your voices as well. So if you ask in the chat, maybe I can just call on you, but I think also I'm going to allow you, if you feel comfortable, you can also just jump in and ask questions. And it will be, hopefully as we go along, I'll create space for that. Okay, so to that end, I want to actually begin by asking you all a question and get just some initial responses. So I want you to just take a minute to think about this question, which is, how do you define Zionism? And what are the feelings or emotions that the word provokes for you? Are they positive and why? Are they negative and why? And let's just get a couple reactions from all of you to those questions, and then we'll get into some of the history together. So to just repeat, how do you define Zionism? And what is your emotional response to the word? Positive or negative or ambivalent, and why?
I'll jump in. Thank you
Great,
so much.
thank you so much, Gretchen.
I'm Gretchen Kugel. I go back to the very classic Theodore Herzl model of there is still anti-Semitism in the world. We need our own homeland. And having just been in Israel, I feel that really strongly. That said, I'm very, very, in America, I think there's a sense that it doesn't exist so much anymore, and we don't need Israel so much anymore. And in particular, with the more intellectual liberal left wing, there's a kind of an intellectual form of anti-Semitism going on that makes Israel vital today, despite the politics of the country that I don't agree with.
Okay.
So I think we need it now as much as we did when Herzl framed his reason why.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, Leslie. And I'll try to scroll through my screen to see who else has their hand up.
I too think of a sort of classic going back to Theodore Herzl, and after the Dreyfus affair, his realization that every other country seems to have a homeland. I mean, every other culture seems to have a homeland, and the Jews don't. So the necessity of having a homeland that would give respect and importance to Jewish values and to Jews. And I too was in Israel just a few weeks ago, and I guess I'm also very troubled because I grew up. I'm the same age as Israel, and my birthday happened this year to fall on Israel's birthday, and I was in Israel for it. So, but for me, Israel was this liberal, welcoming state that was going to correct the bad things that states do sometimes. And now I find it falling prey to the same problems that we have in the United States and we have in Turkey and all these countries all over the world that are turning to fascism. And I find that very disturbing, even though I know that because we have friends in Israel, that there are large numbers of people who in Israel, Israelis who are fighting against this, but I do find it very disturbing.
Okay.
I'm going to speak up. My name is Sally. I'm confused by what Zionism means. Oftentimes I think of it as almost a dirty word, if you will. And I very much share the perspectives that Elizabeth and Sue Pickens have written in the chat. It may have started out with one definition, but I don't think. But I think it's taken on a whole different flavor. I think for many people, it's rabid. It's kind of rabid, pro whatever Israel wants to do or its government wants to do is fine, and that's clearly not where I am or anybody else who has spoken is. But I don't consider it a good term to use because I don't know that it has an accepted definition today.
Okay, great. I'm sure that there are other, voices we could bring into this, and we could, spend many, many more minutes and hours just on this particular question. But I think a number of the comments have already brought up some of the central ideas that I think permeate this conversation, or some of the central maybe questions. So on one hand is the basic sort of riddle or dilemma that was just offered, which is, what does this term even mean today? Does it mean support for everything the state of Israel does? Does it mean support for the state of Israel as a state? Does it mean support for the security of Jews in the land of Israel? Does it mean a place where Jewish values are given concrete form in terms of politics? These are all very different things. And it could be that they're at odds with each other. A state that gives form to certain Jewish values may, as somebody interprets it, may lead one to be quite critical of the Israeli state. So then it would seem that Zionism has these potential contradictions embedded within it. So on one hand, there's a question of what is, an open question as to what does the term mean. On the other, several of you mentioned that as a response to anti-Semitism, the idea that Jews would have a homeland like any other people seems to be one that is inarguable. How could you dispute, A, that there is anti-Semitism in the world, or B, that Jews should have a homeland? And yet, as we'll see, when Zionism emerged, it was far from unanimously accepted among Jews of the time. It was extremely controversial. Other Jews of all different kinds disagreed and opposed Zionism vehemently. Through up until the 1930s, Zionism was largely a peripheral movement within Jewish life, certainly not anything near, a majority of Jews would consider themselves supporters of Zionism until, one could even argue until the 40s. So then the question is, why would ideas that seem to be to us so self-evident, why would they have been so controversial at the time? And I think we could, it's not as if those controversies have ended, as many of you noted. There are dynamics unfolding today that that lead many to question whether Zionism could be something that is, supported, celebrated, affirmed, or whether, as it was noted again in the last comment, is this in some ways a dirty word? So part of what I hope to do by looking back to the beginning of the argument is by just is asking the question as to what extent are the controversies that we're immersed in today, how new are they? And what is the relationship between the debates that we're having now and the debates that were unfolding in Zionism's origins? But to get us into that question, or into that broad issue, I want to lift up something that was said in the first comment, which is that Zionism as a response to anti-Semitism is as necessary today as it was when Herzl wrote Judenstaat in the 1890s. And I think that's a very common view that Zionism was a response to anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. And of course, there is a great deal of truth in that, and we'll see that when we get into the text. But it provokes an immediate question, which is, anti-Semitism did not begin in Europe in the late 19th century. And in fact, by basically any measure one could take, the 19th century was for Jews in Europe the best century in terms of just Jewish life condition since for millennia, since one could argue the fall of the Second Temple. Jews were massacred by the thousands in the Crusades in the 11th century. There was no movement to return to the land of Israel among those Jews. Jews were expelled from England in the 12th century. No movement to return to the land of Israel. Jews were expelled from Spain in the 15th century. There was no movement to return to the land of Israel. And then in the 19th century, after the French Revolution, Jews were emancipated in France, for the first time allowed access to government posts, to all sorts of employment that they had been denied, from law to university professorships, able to buy land. And then as Napoleon conquers the west areas of Europe, those opportunities are extended to the Jews in the lands that he conquers. This is known as the process of emancipation. So in country after country after country, Jews go from the periphery of European life in shtetls where they had their own communities and their own legal systems, in many ways their own criminal justice systems. They policed themselves. But they were, of course, not able to participate in European society in any significant extent. And by the end of the 19th century, Jews are judges, lawyers, politicians, all across Europe. So there's an immediate riddle that Zionism provokes, which is, for centuries and centuries and centuries, Jews in Europe were victims of horrific violent anti-Semitism. And it's not that of course, it continued in the 19th century, right? I mean, the pogroms of the Pale of Settlement in 1881, the Dreyfus Affair, which was already mentioned, but relative to the previous centuries, there's just no comparison that Jews had far more opportunities in European life in the 19th century than they ever had prior. So the immediate question that the history provokes is, why is it that Zionism emerges at a time when it seems that Jews have new access to the life of Europe? Why is it that for so many centuries, anti-Semitism did not provoke a return to the land of Israel, when suddenly, beginning in the late 19th century, these ideas begin to emerge? So that's the first question that I want to try to respond to as a way of then getting into some of the texts. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and we're just going to very quickly go through a couple slides. Again, this is going to be brutally sort of cursory because I want to really have time to get into the text together. Oh, it turns out that my screen sharing needs to, I thought it worked, but it doesn't.
Okay.
You need to.
I'm going to modify that. Sorry about that. Okay, great. Give it a shot now.
Okay, great. All right. These are just the questions that I just asked. All right. So the key moment to begin with is emancipation, September 28th, 1791. After the French Revolution, the French Assembly, after months and months of debate, decides that Jews are going to have full rights to within French society. And this is what begins to radically transform Jewish life in Europe. And there are a number of different responses. And of course, Reform Judaism being one of them, and Zionism being another, Bundism being another. We'll get into some of the details of this in just a moment. But one of the things to note that emancipation provokes is the question of, what does it entail for Jews to be citizens of the new state? So if Jews are going to have full rights, what do those rights entail? And are Jews able to participate in the French Republic in the way that their non-Jewish neighbors are? And after the French Revolution fails, Napoleon takes power. And in 1806, Napoleon calls together the leaders of the Jewish community from France and the other areas over which he has command at the time. And he calls together a Sanhedrin, right? A Jewish political body hearkening back to the biblical decision-making bodies of the Hebrew republics. And he asks the Sanhedrin, and again, this is Napoleon's term for this group that he's pulling together. It gives you a sense of what, the historical role that Napoleon takes himself to be playing. And he asks them 12 questions that he wants them to respond to. I'm only going to point to a couple of them, but they reflect the central dynamics that begin to unfold in the context of emancipation. So number one, are the French, in the eyes of the Jews, their brethren or their enemies? Number two, what duties does the law prescribe for the Jews towards the French who are not of their faith? Do the Jews who are born in France and who are treated as French citizens regard France as their native country? And do they feel themselves obligated to defend it, to obey its laws, and to submit to all regulations of civil code? What police jurisdiction have the rabbis over the Jews? And what judicial authority do they possess? Again, these are just 5 of the 12, but they give you a sense of the flavor of the questions that Napoleon wants answered, which are basically, show us that you're French first. Show us that the laws of the Republic are the laws that you're going to adhere to and not your archaic, ritualistic laws. Show us that your obligations are first and foremost to other French people and not to other Jews. So this is this set of questions. What is the relationship between the Jews and the new modern nation states that are emerging in Europe? What is that relationship? This comes to be known as the Jewish question. What is the relationship between the newly emancipated Jews and the countries in which they live? Are Jews loyal to the French state, or are they loyal to one another? Are they subject to French law, or are they subject to Jewish law? Now, this sounds abstract and maybe theoretical, but in terms of everyday life, it had very dramatic implications on every single Jew that lived under a society that was newly emancipated. So here's a picture of shtetl life in Europe, as it's often familiarly depicted. If you lived in a Jewish community in Europe for centuries, it was a very self-enclosed community, right? You may have participated in terms of economics with non-Jewish communities and non-Jewish neighbors, and of course non-Jewish rulers. But in terms of your social life, it was purely and entirely within the Jewish world. You sent your kids to a Jewish school. You went to the rabbi for disputes. That was the arena in which life operated. And of course, there was not really opportunities to live outside of that community. Now, that dramatically changes, of course, with emancipation. Suddenly, you can go to a non-Jewish school. You can pursue degrees within the universities of your state. But those opportunities immediately provoke very significant dilemmas for every single Jew living in those conditions. Let's say you have a 10-year-old child, son, and you want to send them to school with your non-Jewish neighbors so that they can have access to these new opportunities. Well, the state schools have school on Saturday. So immediately, first question, do you send them to a state school if it means that you're going to no longer be able to observe, of course, the Sabbath? Various different versions of that central dilemma appear all the time in every aspect of your life. Do you eat food with work colleagues? What are the kinds of sacrifices, compromises that you are willing to make in order to participate in this new society? So that dilemma of sort of at the political level that is referred to as the Jewish question has immediate and specific ramifications and implications for every single Jew living under an emancipated society. Okay, so what are the forces that within this context begin to transform Jewish life? So one I've already hinted at, nationalism. So the idea of the French Revolution and the Republic of liberal democracies that begins to then get repeated throughout Europe is that one has equal rights within a society as a citizen of a state, insofar as one is loyal to that state, so that one declares themselves to be French and is therefore obligated to other Frenchmen. And when you are a student in school, you learn about French history. You learn about what ties all French people together going back centuries. Number two is industrialization. So rapid, dramatic economic transformations that begin to radically shape and shift Jewish life. So in the shtetl world, a great deal of the economics was based around merchant exchange with other Jewish communities and, of course, non-Jewish communities. Well, that begins to become completely transformed in the context of industrialization, and guilds are no longer the mechanism by which economics and professions are organized, and suddenly Jews are thrown into a new economy where being the son or grandson or great grandson of the of a merchant or of a banker or of a baker is no longer sufficient to earn one's livelihood. And then lastly is a scientific revolution that begins to lead many, many Jews to question the basics of Jewish law that had organized their life. So these three forces begin to radically transform Jewish life in the 19th century and provoke a number of different responses. So you know these responses. One of them is the Orthodox response, that Jews should remain apart, should continue to observe Jewish law, should even do so more rigorously in reaction to these modern forces. Second response is liberal, that Jews are a religion like any religion, and they should demonstrate to the world that they're going to be as good Germans as the Christian Germans, or as good Italians as the Christian Italians, and likewise. And Reform Judaism, in some ways, becomes the predominant vehicle for that liberal response. Third is Bundist, Jews who argue that they should have cultural autonomy within larger national or imperial structures, and participate in a social movement with other working people who are organized according to their own ethnic backgrounds. And then lastly, nationalism. Jews are a nation, and that they should have their own national home. And that, of course, is the response of Zionism. So the first thing to just note here, and then we'll get into the dynamics around anti-Semitism and the specifics, but that Zionism is a response to the modern question of what is it that Jews are going to be? What is the meaning of Judaism, and what is the meaning of Jewishness? And that Zionism's response is Jews are a nation, and as a nation, they need their own national home. Now, you can see why, when posed in those terms, Zionism becomes so controversial. Because the Orthodox see this as heretical, right? Jews are a group of people who are obligated to God, and the ingathering of the exiles is going to occur according to God's will, not according to human agency. For liberals who are trying to make the case that no, Jews are a religion, and we are as entitled to rights and obligations of citizenry, just like Christian French, just like Christian Italians, for the Zionists to come along and say, no, 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 we're actually a separate nation. Well, to the liberals, that's just confirming what the anti-Semites of France are saying, who are telling them, no, 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 you can never be French because you're Jewish. Well, then the Zionists come along and say, they're right. That, of course, is extremely controversial and offensive and dangerous to the liberals. And this is why when the first Zionist Congress is called in 1896, and it's initially going to be held in Munich, the Orthodox and the liberals get together, which is something that is quite rare in Jewish history at the time, get together to say, no, this cannot happen in our city. The Zionists are a threat to the process of equality and freedom that we are committed to, because they are saying that, no, we're not Germans, we're actually this other nation. Okay, so that gives you a sort of sense of the backdrop. Now, I think in terms of thinking about what did all of the early Zionists agree on, they agreed on two fundamental principles. One, Jews are a nation. Two, to survive and flourish, they must have a homeland. That is what all nations have, and the Jews need it as well. Now, those are the basic commitments that, in my view, and I think most other scholars, that's what all Zionists of the early period share. Now, where they depart from one another is on all of the questions of what this might mean. So let's look at some of those questions. Where should the homeland be? Why should it be there? What is the purpose of it? Survival of the Jews, flourishing of Judaism, economic revolution, creation of a new Jewish person? What should be its structure? Should it be a Jewish state where Jews have a parliament and Jews have a prime minister? Or is it just a community where there are enough Jews together that they can live in terms of, having their own language, being able to organize their life together in some sort of critical mass? How should it be achieved? Should it be achieved over time with just Jews trickling into the area? Should it be achieved through negotiations with the imperial powers? Should it be achieved through negotiations with the population that lives there now? Or should it be achieved just through Jews picking up arms and fighting for it? How should Zionism treat Jews outside of the homeland? What is the relationship between Jews who live in this homeland and outside of it? Is it that all Jews are going to go to the homeland? Is it that the homeland in some ways is going to energize and inspire Jews outside of it? What is the view of the Jewish past and Jewish religion? Is Zionism a revolution against that past? Is Zionism attempting to discard the Jewish past of rabbinic law, or is it in some sense a continuity? Is it trying to fulfill that past? And then lastly, and what becomes more and more and more important in the Zionist movement into the 20s, 30s, and of course through to today, how should Jews and non-Jews live together or not in the new homeland? what is the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in this area that is going to be the Jewish homeland? So those are the central questions that Zionists argue about, and they argue about it from the very beginning. So there are generally considered 5 strands of Zionist thought, and I'm very briefly going to rattle through them, and then we're going to look at some of the founding figures of these traditions. Political Zionism, generally associated with Herzl, often described as a project of normalization, a place where Jews can just be citizens and have access to the opportunities of the modern world, but they can do so as Jews without converting to outside of Judaism. Cultural Zionism, the idea that the homeland's central purpose is a flourishing of Jewish culture and Jewish values, whatever that might mean. Labor or socialist Zionism, which is based on the idea that only as a nation can Jews participate in economic revolution or in the economic struggle for a more just world. Religious Zionism, which is, of course, the idea that only through return to the homeland can Jews fulfill God's command. And then lastly, revisionist Zionism, which breaks from the Zionist movement in the early 20s and argues that Zionism, the fundamental dispute between revisionist Zionism and the other Zionisms is first of all on means. The revisionists argue that the only way that Zionism can be achieved is through military force. And in terms of ends, the revisionists argued that the entire land of Israel and Transjordan, which was the British mandate, should be a Jewish state. So they revise both the means and the ends of the Zionist movement. Jabotinsky is generally considered the founder of revisionist Zionism. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to look at some text together. But I also want to just check in on the chat and see who I've been ignoring. Sorry, let me stop my share. Okay. Any questions before we jump into some text together?
And I'll recommend if you have a question and we're not seeing you, feel free to follow like the Torah Study Minhag. You could put your name in the chat and then we could call out your name.
Also okay if folks are just okay with where we're at. Okay, great. All right, so I put together a source sheet and I want to spend about 30 minutes in that source sheet. Jabotinsky is the name of, Zev Jabotinsky is the name of the founder of revisionist Zionism. So I've pulled up more, I put together more sources than we're gonna have time to look at. I did that somewhat intentionally, so you could go back to it. There are 8 passages that I've pulled, including 2 that at the end that point towards American Zionism and its emergence with Emma Lazarus and Louis Brandeis. I think we're probably not going to have time in our brief time together to get into that, which is totally fine. I would suggest, I want you to look for sure at Leon Pinsker, whose book or pamphlet, Auto-Emancipation, is sometimes considered, it's actually not the first Zionist text, but it's the first that was distributed widely. Herzl once said, in what was almost certainly not true, that if he had read Auto-Emancipation, he would not have written Judenstaat. But he did say that. So look at the Pinsker, look at the Herzl, and look at Ahad Am, who is generally considered the founder of cultural Zionism. And then jump to Jabotinsky. And then if you have time, double back and you can look at Rav Kook, generally considered the founder of religious Zionism, and Aaron Gordon, often considered one of the founding figures of labor Zionism. I'm going to put the source sheet in the chat. There's a few questions on the first page to just guide your discussion. I can put those questions here in the chat as well. You don't need to talk about all of these. You can really, see where the conversation takes you. Sorry. But these are the questions that I'm hoping you can discuss and we'll talk about together. How does the writer understand the problem to which Zionism responds? How would you summarize the aim of Zionism as the writer describes it? What in the text aligns with your expectation? What surprises you? What resonates with you? What troubles you? What questions? And then what do you find most relevant? And again, I'm gonna put in bold the ones that I'm hoping you look at. And I think for reasons that I think will probably be relatively obvious, if there's 5 minutes left in our 30 minutes and you haven't gotten to Jabotinsky, jump to Jabotinsky just so you have a chance to read it before we come back together as a group. Sound good? I'm going to put you in groups of 4. So we're going to have a bunch of groups, but I want to be sure that folks have a chance to talk. Does that sound okay, Rabbi Stein? I can go larger or smaller, depending on what your practice is as a congregation.
I think 4 is great if it works for everyone here. I know that there are some people who are logged in 2 or 3 people to a screen. So if you are and your group isn't working for you, just let us know and we can put you in a different one.
Okay. It looks like I need you to set up the groups. Or no, I can do it now. Okay. It's not telling me the.
Also, Daniel, could you put the source sheet in the chat?
Yeah, I thought I did. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, funny. I accidentally sent it to just one of you.
Yeah, you just sent it to Mariah.
Yeah, I noticed that. Sorry about that.
I appreciate
I don't
feeling
know.
special.
I don't know why that happened. Okay, so we're gonna do 10 groups and hopefully this will work.
Great. And I'd recommend folks open the source sheet now before you go to breakout rooms, just in case you lose this chat. But we can always send it to the breakout rooms if you don't have it.
All right, welcome back. So hopefully folks had a chance to look at a few of these texts and begin to dig into it. As I said, there's more there than we have time for, but wanted to provide something that those who are interested could look at some more in the coming days and weeks as you continue in your learning. But for the last 20 minutes, I'm really hoping that we can just have a conversation together about what folks took from these texts, what questions emerged, what surprised you, what did not surprise you, and why might any of these arguments, discussions be relevant for today. So why don't we just jump into it rather than sort of taking each text one by one, given our short time, just let's get some reactions. What jumped out at folks initially as far as what grabbed you? And I see a hand from Joel. We'll start with you.
So first of all, it was a lot, so we didn't really read it all.
Sure, of course.
The suggestion was to give it ahead of time, but I have a question, and we discussed it a little bit, and it was from what I wrote before, but I always thought of Zionism as being stemming from or touched upon the concept of that this land is promised to us by God, and that we're a chosen people. And it's unclear whether that is what Zionism is, because as you said, there's so many definitions of it. But to me, I thought it was rooted in that, and that's what. When you asked what's emotional about the question, I said that's concern, that this is our land because God gave it to us and we deserve it, and that's the answer. And how we implement it is, of course, the challenge, but the deep part of Zionism is that it's our land in the first place.
Okay, so did anybody see that idea? Now, of course, I pulled out selections from longer pieces, so you're gonna have to trust me on the on the larger summaries. But did anybody see that idea in what we looked at? Did anybody see a writer reject that idea? Leslie, where is it rejected?
Well, in the first text that we read, I forget.
Yeah, Leon Pinsker.
Yeah, this idea that it could be anywhere. And I think that Herzl himself was looking in Africa for a homeland. I mean, the idea was to have a homeland where Jews could come, a safe harbor, as opposed to, I mean, for them, I agree with you, Joel, that, you know, there is this idea also that Israel is the promised land, but at least in these writers, or in that writing, it was really more about the need to have a homeland than it was for it to be Israel.
Okay, so first of all, I want to just note the language there of safe harbor, which implies a refuge from persecution. And I think that idea is one that you could argue shows up in somebody like Herzl, but is actually not, I think, the dominant idea in the emergence of classical political Zionism. When you have time and you can look at someone like Emma Lazarus, who's most famous for the poem that she wrote at the base of the Statue of Liberty. But Emma Lazarus has a series of poems in the 1880s that very clearly and specifically describe the land of Israel as a safe harbor. And that idea becomes central to American Zionism. But the reason that it's not so central in European Zionism is because the European Zionists are part of a project of transforming Judaism, transforming the meaning of Jewishness. What is this? What are we going to be in the modern era? And that's not simply a project of a safe harbor or a refuge for a people that's already existed. So as you see very clearly in Pinsker, to start off, Pinsker says, our fundamental problem is we're not yet a nation. So it's no surprise that the other nations don't respect us. It's no surprise that we're looked down upon. It's no surprise that we ourselves don't have the confidence to be treated as equals. So what we need is to become a nation. And that's what Zionism is going to provide, which is a very different idea than safe harbor. And to make the point even starker when it comes to Pinsker and how Pinsker thinks about where this land should be. Pinsker is not just sort of open to it being in other places. Pinsker is specifically concerned about the homeland being in the land of Israel. Now, why would he be specifically concerned if the Bible says that the land of Israel belongs to the Jews? Why would someone say that's actually not where we should have our homeland? Which is what, Pinsker was not alone in this. There were other Zionists who agreed precisely that the homeland should not be the land of Israel. Why would they maybe think that?
Well, that was rejected. Wasn't that rejected?
Well, it was rejected, but before we get to why it was rejected, why would someone like Pinsker be worried about it being in the land of Israel? Any thoughts? Lou, are you responding to this or something else?
Unmute.
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 Well, you had your hands up. Why don't you say something?
What I want to say is that it seems I think it's really a terrific introduction to the topic. But I think most of the early settlers who went to Israel were inspired not by Zionism of a particular sort, Eastern European socialism, the kibbutzim, and the idea of remaking Jewish people into something very different from what we have observed. And I sort of would like to get your comment, Dan, on the issue of, if you wanted to leave Eastern Europe, which was a very good idea, you could come to America and you could kind of have it all. You wouldn't have to fight the mosquitoes. You'd had a very prosperous area and you had religious freedom pretty much. So if it wasn't for the Holocaust and the fact that our country and other countries denied exodus to the Jews, maybe we wouldn't have Israel. But Israel really became a necessity because as a Jewish homeland, because of the Nazis and the persecution there, and the attitude of the rest of the world towards the Jewish suffering.
Okay, so a number of important points. Let me just speak first to the point I was raising earlier. For someone like Pinsker, and to a certain extent someone like Herzl too, and others, Zionism was, as in the project of making the Jews a nation, was also a project of making the Jews modern. We're no longer going to be tied together by believing these irrational laws of, what we should eat, within hours of something else that we shouldn't eat. Like that can't be what Judaism is going to mean in the modern world. We're enlightened people. We are going to determine our future according to ourselves. We are not going to determine it based on the notion that God wrote this book, right? That's superstitious, right? That's how could we believe that after Spinoza? How could we believe that after Kant, right? So for someone like Pinsker, it's specifically because he wants Zionism to be a modern movement that rejects this idea that what binds together the Jews is that they believe that this particular book was written by God. So it would make no sense for Pinsker to say, well, we should go to this land because that's the land that God gave us, right? As somebody, he was a doctor, he was involved in efforts for enlightenment and science, and was initially a big fan of emancipation before the pogroms in 1881, when he becomes disillusioned about the prospect of Jews becoming full citizens. At that point, he was in the Russian Empire. So Pinsker was specifically concerned that and warned against the idea of what would happen if the Jewish homeland was in a place where ostensibly it was given by God. Now, as several noted, in 1906, Herzl gets an agreement from the British Empire for a plot of land in Uganda, and Herzl wants to do it. Herzl's sympathetic to Pinsker's concerns. He thinks for Herzl, we just need a place where we can have control over our own communities. It doesn't need to be in the land of Israel, and there's reasons to not have it in the land of Israel. But Herzl, his motion at the 1906 Zionist Congress is soundly defeated, because for many other Zionists, the idea was specifically that the homeland needed to be in the land of Israel. And those Zionists were shaped by people like Ahad Ha'am, who maybe some of you had a chance to look at, which was the pen name of Asher Ginsburg, Ahad Ha'am meaning one of the people. Ahad Ha'am, generally considered the founder of cultural Zionism, argued that Zionism was about reviving the Jewish people, and that project of revival could only happen if the Jews had a homeland in the land of Israel. And then, of course, religious Zionists like Rav Kook and then his followers, who argued that the whole project of Zionism was about fulfilling God's command, and that there were commandments that you could only really fully be a Jew in the land of Israel. But Rav Kook was, again, a very peripheral figure in the 1890s and early decades of the 20th century within Zionism, because most Zionists were secular, thought they were rejecting the Jewish law, and he was a peripheral figure within Orthodoxy, who most observant Jews saw Zionism as heretical. Now, the point that you raised about the United States, important to note, from 1880 to 1920, I imagine, like my own family, many people on this call, that's when your families came to the United States. It was a period when roughly 2.8 million Jews from Europe, 95% of those from Eastern Europe, came to the United States. Over that same period, roughly 140,000 went to Palestine, mandatory Palestine under the at the time, Ottoman and then British, right? So 5%. So that gives you a sense of how peripheral, or what a minority Zionists were, even in the context of this response to in this flight from Eastern Europe in the context of the pogroms of the 19th century. Okay, other things that jumped out to folks.
I had a question. This is Doug.
Yeah, great.
It relates a little to what you were talking about earlier, but from the piece you gave us on Pinsker, who I've not read much of before, if anything, what I saw was no language saying it shouldn't or can't be in Israel. What I saw was language saying we cannot go back with the thought that we will be reforming the Holy Land that we had a couple of millennia ago. Is he elsewhere opposed to returning to Israel because it would be too much trouble to weed through those who thought they were back in the Holy Land versus those who were building something new? Or how does that all fit together? Because as I said, in the piece you sent us, he said, don't think when you go, if you go back there, that it will be the Holy Land. But he didn't say, don't go back to Palestine or Israel.
I guess maybe I'm reading into we must not attach ourselves to the place where our political life was once violently interrupted and destroyed. The goal of our present endeavors must not be the Holy Land, but of our land of our own. So you could, and there were other Zionists that made this point more specifically. So maybe I'm in some ways using Pinsker to draw the bigger point. In some ways, Pinsker is, sure, you could say he's open to it, and other places in the writing, he does say in this particular text, he does say he's open to it. But you could see why that line of argument would lead one to be, and others, to be concerned about the land of Israel as the place because of the connotations that it has as the Holy Land. If what you're trying to do is create this modern society. And there were other Zionists who were much more explicit when the Uganda controversy unfolds, those who argued that including some rabbis, interestingly enough, who argued that it would be far better in Uganda precisely because they worried about either the seculars worried about ideas of religion contaminating the project, or some more observant folks worried about the project being seen as a sort of usurping God's will. So I guess I was maybe just underscoring a point that's in Pinsker that in order to make a larger point that other Zionists made at the time.
Well, seeing now that Jabotinsky was 100% correct 100 years ago, did he ever write anything on the subject of Uganda? Because I can't imagine that he would have thought that the Ugandans would be more happy to give up their land to Jews than the Arabs would.
Jabotinsky was not yet involved in the Zionist movement in 1906, but you're absolutely right that would have been his argument, and he probably would have said something about how the only way to garner enough sort of popular will and support among Jews was for the land of Israel to be the place, which is ultimately why secular Zionists agreed that the Uganda plan was not going to work, because there was just no way that that Jews just did not have enough attachment. They had enough of a hard time getting a few dozen thousands to move to Palestine, let alone Uganda, when Jews had spent centuries actually saying that they wanted to return to the land of Israel. We only have 5 minutes remaining. Rabbi Stein has had her hand up. I want to just note that on this, on the specific point about the linking of religion and the question of God's will, for those who have time and interest, Rav Kook is the person to look at in the passages who makes that argument most explicitly. And then let's just spend a few minutes talking about Jabotinsky, Rabbi Stein, and then we'll close.
Great. So I think I just also wanted to plant the question, and maybe we won't get it in the next 5 minutes, in which case we could insert it into a future Limmud. But I wondered if you could speak a little bit to, so these were sort of like really interesting thinkers who were engaged with the conversations of their day, and kind of like, what for you is the import of our immersing ourselves in their words, sort of like in this moment in time and in this place in the world?
So I'll say a couple words on that to close in just a few minutes. But I already heard just a couple of people in the chat on, someone said that Jabotinsky was amazing. And someone else, noted that he was right about a lot. So I'm curious what jumped out to folks from that text. Yeah, Leslie. And then...
Well, I just thought his description of the hatred that people feel when another group comes in, like, were the native peoples delighted to see the British come in and to Plymouth Rock, or this whole notion that it's really sort of hopeless unless you build an iron wall. And I thought that image of the iron wall was very interesting, because in some ways I feel that is what Israel has been forced or chosen. I mean, I don't know which word is better to use, but has wound up doing in places, well, literally building walls.
So I do think that
One of the things,
no, go ahead, please. Is that
no,
Karen?
yes, one of the things that someone made the comment in the chat that it was prescient, and I think prescient in the most negative sense. To me, reading Jabotinsky was listening to Ben-Gvir, and the way it's transformed Israeli society today.
Yeah. So I do think that Jabotinsky is the person that you can most immediately see the sort of lineage in contemporary politics. And in some ways, it's not coincidental. Netanyahu's father, some may know, was Ben Zion Netanyahu, which was he was a renowned scholar of Spanish Judaism, wrote a massive book on the Inquisition. He was also Jabotinsky's secretary. So in terms of the sort of lineage of revisionist Zionism into the Likud party, it's basically that is the sort of intellectual genesis. Now, among the things that's very different about Jabotinsky and Ben-Gvir is that Jabotinsky saw himself as a militant secularist. He famously said that he didn't care whether he was cremated or buried so long as it was in the land of Israel, which is a pretty striking thing for a Jew to say, but tells you a lot about Jabotinsky's orientation. As far as what I think are some of the reasons to turn back to these texts is because I do think that at the root of Zionism is an idea about Jewish nationalism. What does it mean to be a nation? How should that nation be expressed? And nationalism, one could argue, is simply the way in which the modern world is organized. But nationalism has very, very significant dangers. And I think that there is a way within the story of American Zionism that we think about, and some of this has to do with the Holocaust, as was mentioned earlier, we think about Israel primarily as a refuge, as in a place in which people could go if they were being persecuted. And that's not really how the early Zionists thought of it. They thought of it as a project of transformation that was going to make the Jews a modern nation. And I think if we're going to be engaged in a Zionist conversation, we need to be thinking about the ways in which that project of nationalism has unfolded and is going to unfold, rather than simply imagine that a homeland could be, a refuge for, some pre-existing people, but rather see it as a project of really revolution that is trying to transform Jews into something. And that is both part of what, for those who are compelled by the story is so inspiring, but it also, I think, helps illuminate some of the dangers and challenges that we're living with today. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks again so much for the invitation. Thanks, Rabbi Stein. It was great to be with you. Great to be with all of you, and good luck with your learning over the summer. Enjoy it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, and both to Dr. Daniel May. We really appreciate your presentation, and to everybody who came, and we'll look forward to seeing many of you next week for our next moment in the series. Got some requests. I will be sending out this source sheet for folks who want to look at it more on their own. I'm also really hoping to send out the recording. I've been getting some troubling Zoom notifications as we go about the extent to which it's working with our TRS cloud. So fingers crossed for that, but we'll send the thing. And thank you all so much for being here. And Daniel, thank you so much again. Have a great day, everybody.
Very nice. Thank you so much. Very nice.